She arrived in chains she couldn't see, bound by a marriage contract she never signed willingly, shipped like cargo to a dying ranch at the edge of nowhere. They called it a fresh start. She called it what it was. A death sentence disguised as a wedding. Silas Crowe, the most powerful man in Blackstone Ridge, had smiled when he arranged it. That smile alone should have warned everyone. Because men like Crowe never do anything out of kindness. They only move pieces on a board, and Delilah Mercer had just become the most dangerous piece he never saw coming. If you've ever been underestimated, this story is for you. Stay until the end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The wagon smelled like pine resin and old leather, and it groaned with every frozen rut in the road, as though the earth itself was warning her to turn back. Delilah Mercer sat upright on the hard wooden bench, her wool coat pulled tight across her broad shoulders, her dark eyes fixed on the horizon ahead where the mountains of Blackstone Ridge rose like broken teeth against a pewter sky. She didn't cry. She had made herself a promise 3 days ago, when the wagon pulled away from her sister's front porch in Caldwell. She would not cry, not in front of strangers, not on this road, not ever where someone could see and call it weakness. The driver, a leathered old man named Corbett who smelled of tobacco and bad luck, hadn't said more than a dozen words since they left the stage depot at dawn. That suited her fine. She wasn't in the mood for conversation. She wasn't in the mood for much of anything except surviving the next few hours with her dignity intact. She was 28 years old. She was not small, not delicate, not the kind of woman who got poems written about her or flowers left on her doorstep. She was broad and strong and sharp-tongued when pushed, and the world had spent the better part of her life reminding her that these were not qualities men celebrated in a wife. Her father had said it plainly, the way only fathers can wound without flinching. Delilah, you are not the marrying kind, you are the surviving kind. There's a difference, and you'd better make peace with it. She had spent 10 years proving him wrong. And then, in a single afternoon, Silas Crowe had proved him right. She first heard the name Silas Crowe the way most people did, through someone else's fear. It was her cousin Agnes who mentioned him, in a letter that arrived at the boarding house in Caldwell, where Delilah had been working as a bookkeeper for a dry goods merchant named Hollis. Agnes wrote in her cramped, nervous handwriting about a land baron in the Northern Valley who had been buying up ranches for pennies on the dollar after the original owners mysteriously fell into impossible debt. She wrote about roads that got blocked, and wells that ran dry, and cattle that disappeared in the night. She wrote, "They say he owns the judge, the sheriff, and half the town council. They say if Silas Crowe wants something, there is no law in Blackstone Ridge that will stop him from taking it." Delilah had read that letter twice, tucked it away, and gone back to balancing Hollis's accounts. She was good with numbers. Numbers didn't lie to you the way people did. Numbers were honest about what they were. She should have stayed with her numbers. But her employer, old Hollis, had borrowed money from Silas Crowe's bank to expand his store. And when the expansion failed and the loan came due, Crowe collected in the cruelest currency he could find. He didn't take the building, he didn't take the merchandise. He took Delilah's position, her wages, and then sat across from her in Hollis's back office one rainy November morning, and offered her something so outrageous that for a full 10 seconds she forgot how to breathe. "There's a man named Elias Boone," Crowe had said, folding his hands on the table like a banker discussing a modest investment. He was a tall man, silver-haired, with a face that would have been handsome if not for the particular coldness of his eyes, the kind of cold that wasn't weather but choice. "He owns a ranch north of the valley, or rather he owed a ranch. The debt is mine now. He's behind 4 seasons and the property is barely standing. I need someone to go out there and manage the household. Keep the place running through winter." "You need a housekeeper," she said flatly. "I need a wife," he said without blinking. "For him, on paper. It makes the arrangement look charitable. It keeps the community from asking too many questions about why I haven't foreclosed yet." He tilted his head slightly. "And it keeps you employed, housed, and fed through the coldest months of the year, which, given your current situation, is not a small thing." Delilah stared at him for a long moment. "You're arranging a marriage," she said slowly, "between a woman you've just made unemployed and a man drowning in debt that you control. I prefer to think of it as solving 2 problems at once." "And if I refuse?" Crowe smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "Then you leave this office with nothing, in a town where I own the largest employer, the only bank, and 3 of the 5 boarding houses. Winter is 6 weeks away, Miss Mercer. He stood, straightening his jacket. I'll give you until morning. She had walked out of that office and stood in the November rain for a long time. She had nowhere to go. That was the truth of it, stripped of all pride and pretense. She had no family close enough to reach before the cold set in, no savings, no prospects. Crow hadn't broken her, not yet, but he had arranged the walls so carefully that escape looked exactly like surrender. So she signed. And she made herself one more private promise, standing in the rain outside Hollis's dry goods store. Whatever this is, whatever trap he's laid, I will find the edges of it, and I will find a way out. Corbett pulled the wagon to a stop at the top of a long slope, and Delilah looked down for the first time at the Boone Ranch. Her heart sank slightly before she caught it and held it still. The main house was a 2-story structure that might have been handsome once, but the porch railing had collapsed on one end and wasn't going to make it through another heavy snow. The barn roof sagged in the middle in a way that suggested the center beam had either cracked or been compromised. There was a chicken coop listing hard to the left, a water trough with a visible split along its side, and a fence line that looked like it had been repaired so many times it had forgotten its original shape. The land itself was broad and cold and beautiful, rolling hills dusted with the first light snow of the season, a creek line visible through the bare aspens to the east, solid mountain backdrop to the north. Good bones, her father would have said. The land had good bones. The ranch, on the other hand, looked like it was running a fever and trying not to show it. "This is it?" she asked. "This is it," Corbett confirmed, with the profound lack of sympathy of a man who had delivered bad news to enough people that he'd stopped feeling bad about it. She climbed down from the wagon before he could offer to help her, because she had learned long ago that waiting for offers was a good way to wait forever. She pulled her trunk from the back, set it on the frozen ground, and stood there looking at the ranch for one long moment. All right, she thought, let's see what we're working with. The door opened before she reached the porch steps. Elias Boone was not what she expected, though she wasn't entirely sure what she had expected. He was lean in the way that hard years make a man lean, not thin from choice, but worn down from labor and worry and too many nights sleeping poorly. He was maybe 30, maybe 35, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of creek water in autumn, a sort of shifting grey-green that changed when the light changed. He had the hands of someone who worked, knuckles scarred and calloused, and he was holding them slightly awkwardly at his sides, as though he wasn't sure what to do with them when he wasn't working. He looked at her the way people sometimes looked at Delilah, the quick inventory, the slight recalibration, the careful neutralizing of expression. She had seen it 1,000 times. She had stopped being hurt by it long ago. What she watched for now, what she had learned to read quickly, was what came after the recalibration. Some men landed on dismissal, some on pity, some on the particular cruelty of men who have never had much power and find it unexpectedly in the vulnerability of another person. Elias Boone landed somewhere she hadn't expected. He looked, if she was reading it right, deeply and sincerely ashamed. "Miss Mercer," he said. His voice was low and quiet, the kind of voice that had probably been easy and warm once before something knocked the ease out of it. I want you to know that I didn't..." He stopped, started again. "This arrangement wasn't something I asked for. Crow presented it as a condition of extending my note through the winter, and He pressed his lips together. "I said yes before I thought hard enough about what I was agreeing to. That was wrong of me. I'm sorry." Delilah looked at him for a moment. "Was the apology your idea?" she asked. "Or did someone tell you to say it?" He blinked. "My idea." "All right." She picked up the handle of her trunk. "Then I accept it. Are you going to help me with this, or are we going to stand out here until we both freeze?" Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, the memory of a muscle that used to move that way. "I'll take it," he said, and reached for the trunk. The inside of the house was warmer than the outside, which was the best thing that could be said for it. Delilah walked through each room with the systematic attention she had learned from years of bookkeeping, not looking at the surface, but reading the underlying structure. What was cosmetic damage and what was real damage? What could be fixed with labor and what would require materials she wasn't sure they had? The kitchen was workable. The iron stove was sound. The chimney draft was adequate, and someone, Elias presumably, had laid in a reasonable stock of dry wood, though not nearly enough for a full winter. The root cellar under the kitchen floor held potatoes, dried beans, some salt pork, and a disappointing quantity of preserved vegetables. Enough to last 6 or 8 weeks if they were careful, not enough to last a full winter without supplementing. The front room was cold because a window had been patched with oilcloth rather than glass, and the oilcloth had started to separate at one corner. The upstairs had 2 bedrooms, both with intact floors, both needing fresh chinking around the window frames where the wind was finding its way through. The barn was the most pressing problem. She could see it the moment she stepped inside. The main beam overhead had a crack running along its underside that was going to fail under heavy snow load. When it failed, it would bring the roof down on whatever livestock was below. There were 4 horses, 6 cattle, and a scattered assembly of tools and equipment that would be a disaster to lose under a collapsed structure. "How long has that beam been cracked?" she asked. Elias, standing behind her, was quiet for a moment. "Since last spring. Got hit by a widowmaker that came down in the storm. I've been meaning to—" "It needs to come down before the first heavy snow," she said. "We need to sister it. Do you have lumber?" "There's some in the back of the barn. Not sure if it's enough." "Show me." He showed her. It wasn't quite enough, but it was close. She did the math in her head, dimensions, load estimates, the span of the beam, and decided they could make it work if they positioned the sistering supports correctly. "Have you done structural work before?" he asked, watching her examine the lumber. "My uncle ran a lumber mill," she said. "I helped with the books, but I also spent enough time in the yard to learn how wood works." She straightened up. "I need you to be honest with me about something." "All right." "The debt. The number Crow is holding over you. How much is it exactly? And when is the next payment due?" His jaw tightened. $240, due 1st of March. She did the calculation automatically, the way she always did, against what a struggling ranch could realistically generate between now and March, against what resources they currently had, against the cost of the repairs that had to happen before winter set in. The numbers were bad. "Is that the number on your original contract?" she asked. "Should be. Why?" "I want to see the contract," she said. He looked at her with a slightly puzzled expression. "It's just a loan document." "I know what it is," she said. "I want to see the original, not a copy, the original document with both signatures." Something in her tone made him study her more carefully. "It's in the house," he said slowly, "in a box under the desk." "Good," she said. "After we eat tonight, I want to sit down with it and your payment records and go through them together." "Delilah." He stopped. "Can I call you that?" She considered. "It's my name." "Delilah, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I've been over those numbers more times than I can count. There isn't a way through them." She picked up the lantern she'd been using to examine the lumber and turned to face him fully in the thin winter light. "Elias," she said, "I spent 6 years keeping books for a man who thought he understood his own finances. He didn't. Numbers on paper are not the same as the truth underneath them. Someone who knows what to look for can tell the difference." She moved past him toward the barn door. "Let me look. The worst that happens is you're right and we know it for certain." He followed her back toward the house without arguing. She counted that as the first small victory. Dinner that night was salt pork and beans, with cornbread that Delilah made herself because she had noticed, without comment, that the bowl Elias had started on the counter suggested he had been planning to eat the beans cold. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, which was solid good oak and the nicest piece of furniture in the house, and ate mostly in silence while the wind began picking up outside. The oilcloth window in the front room rattled. "I'll fix that window tomorrow," she said. "I can do it." "I know you can. I'm saying I'll help. 2 people working is faster than 1. He looked at her across the table. "Why are you doing this?" "Eating dinner?" "All of it." He gestured vaguely at the house, the barn, the entire project she'd apparently assigned herself in her first 4 hours on the property. "You didn't ask for this any more than I did. You could sit by the stove and wait out the winter and call that your end of the bargain." "Could I?" She set down her fork. "And what would waiting accomplish exactly?" "Nothing," he admitted, "but most people wait anyway." "I'm not most people," she said, without heat or pride, just as a statement of fact. "And a collapsing barn doesn't wait because I'm feeling sorry for myself." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The contract is in the box. I'll get it after dinner." "Thank you." They ate the rest of the meal in a silence that had changed quality, less like the silence of strangers and more like the silence of people who have reached a tentative understanding. The box held 3 years of paperwork. Delilah sat at the kitchen table with the lantern turned up as high as it would go, and went through everything methodically while Elias sat across from her, occasionally answering questions, more often just watching her work. She read the original loan contract twice. Then she read it a third time, slowly, tracing the language with her fingertip. "When did you sign this?" she asked. "March 3 years ago. I needed capital to restock after the drought. And this number here, the principal amount," she pointed. "This was $200? That's right. And the interest rate written here is 4% annually. That's what Crow's man said when we went over it." Delilah set the contract down and picked up the payment ledger. She did the arithmetic in her head first, then on the back of an old envelope to be certain. "Elias," she said carefully, "at 4% on $200 after 3 years, with the payments you've made according to this ledger," she turned the envelope toward him, "you should owe approximately $40, not $240. He stared at the numbers. "That can't be right." "It's arithmetic. It doesn't lie." She picked up the contract again, holding it closer to the lantern. "But look at this." She pointed to a line near the bottom of the contract, in the section that described the interest terms. The ink there was slightly different from the rest of the document. Not dramatically, not obviously, but she had spent years examining documents, and she knew the difference between ink that had dried together and ink that had dried at different times. "This numeral," she said, this 4. Do you remember when you signed this, whether that said 4% or something else?" Elias leaned in close. His expression changed. "It said 4, he said. Then, more slowly, "I'm almost certain it said 4. "Because the way this is written," she said quietly, "it could be read as 14. The loop at the bottom of the 1 is very close to the paper edge. If someone had added a stroke..." She stopped herself, looked up at him. "Who else has Crow lent money to in this valley?" she asked. Elias sat back in his chair. He was quiet for a long time, and the wind outside found the loose corner of the oilcloth and made it tap rhythmically against the window frame. "Nearly every ranch in the valley took out notes from his bank after the drought years," he finally said. "Most of them are still carrying the debt. And how many of them are also behind on payments that shouldn't have grown this large?" He looked at her across the table, in the circle of lantern light, with the cold pressing in from every direction. "All of them," he said slowly. "Every ranch I know of." Delilah looked back down at the contract. At the ink that had dried at 2 different times. The numbers were talking to her now, the way numbers always did when she listened carefully enough. And what they were saying was not a story about bad luck or poor management or the harsh mathematics of frontier debt. What they were saying was the story of something deliberate, something calculated, something that had been done to all of them, on purpose, by a man who smiled when he arranged the pieces on the board. Outside, the first real snow of the season began to fall, steady and silent and deep, settling over Blackstone Ridge like a secret being kept. Delilah Mercer folded her hands on the table, looked at the evidence in front of her, and began, quietly and methodically, to plan. The snow fell all night. By morning, the valley was white, and somewhere in Blackstone Ridge, in a warm office with a fire burning high and a glass of good whiskey at his elbow, Silas Crow reviewed his accounts and thought, not for the first time, how satisfying it was to own a problem before the problem knew it was owned. He had not yet learned to worry about Delilah Mercer. That was his first mistake. The snow that fell the first night didn't stop for 3 days. By the time it finally relented, the world outside the Boone Ranch had been reorganized entirely. Fence posts buried to their crossbars. The creek reduced to a thin, dark line through a field of white. The mountains behind the valley swallowed into grey clouds so completely it was difficult to tell where the land ended and the sky began. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees the second night, and Delilah woke before dawn to the sound of the cattle in the barn, making the particular low, anxious sound that livestock make when they are cold and uncertain. She was dressed and out the door before Elias had his boots on. "You don't have to," he started from the top of the porch steps. "The water trough is frozen," she called back, already crossing the yard. "Bring the axe." He brought the axe. That was how the first week settled into its shape. Not through any formal agreement or conversation about roles, but through the simple accumulation of work that needed doing, and the mutual, unspoken understanding that neither of them could afford the luxury of waiting for the other to start. Delilah was up first most mornings, reading the rancher's needs the way she read a ledger, identifying the most urgent problem and moving toward it before the cold could make it worse. Elias followed her lead with less resistance than she'd expected from a man who had been running to, or failing to run, his own property for years. She had braced herself for pride, for the particular stubbornness of men who would rather let something fail than admit they needed help managing it. But Elias Boone, she was learning, had been humbled so thoroughly by circumstance that there wasn't much pride left to fight through. What remained was something quieter and more useful, a willingness to work, and a steadiness under pressure that she found herself depending on more than she'd anticipated. The barn beam was the first major project. They worked on it over 2 full days, Delilah directing the placement of the sister boards while Elias handled the heavy lifting with a calm, methodical strength that reminded her of the way water works. Not dramatic, but persistent, wearing down the problem by simply refusing to stop. When the last bolt was set and the new support took the load, they both stood back and looked up at the repaired structure in the cold barn air, breathing hard, and said nothing for a moment. "That'll hold," Elias said finally. "It'll hold," she agreed. It was the most satisfied she had felt in months. The window in the front room came next, real glass this time, salvaged from a broken frame in the unused back bedroom and cut down to fit. A project that required 3 attempts and cost Delilah a shallow cut across 2 knuckles before the pane finally seated correctly. Then the porch railing, rebuilt with lumber from the barn stores. Then a systematic re-chinking of every window frame in the house, working from the top floor down, packing the gaps with a mixture of clay and straw and old rope fiber that Delilah had found described in a homesteading manual she'd pulled from the shelf above the kitchen hearth. "Where did you learn to do all this?" Elias asked one evening, watching her work on the last upstairs window by lantern light. "I didn't learn it all at once," she said, pressing the chinking mixture into the gap with her thumb. "I learned pieces of things from different places. My uncle's mill, the boarding house where I worked 2 winters ago. The landlady there knew how to fix everything, and she believed in teaching you while she worked, so she didn't have to do it alone." Delilah paused. "And I read. There are books that tell you how things work if you're willing to sit with them." The manual downstairs. That one and others. Knowledge is the one thing that doesn't cost anything if you're willing to put in the time. He was quiet for a moment. "My father built this ranch," he said. "He knew how to do everything. I grew up watching him and I thought I learned enough." He looked at the window frame she was working on. "Turns out, watching and doing are different things. Most things look easier from the outside," she said, not unkindly. He nodded slowly. "I should have asked for help sooner, before the debt got where it is." "Yes," she said, because she believed in honest answers. "But you didn't, and here we are, and the window is getting chinked regardless." She smoothed the last section of mixture and sat back. "Done. That should cut the draft in half by tomorrow morning." Elias held up the lantern so she could see her work. "It's good," he said. And then, after a pause, "Thank you, Delilah." She picked up her tools and didn't answer right away, because the gratitude in his voice had a quality she wasn't accustomed to, not the relieved gratitude of someone who had expected nothing and gotten something, but the heavier, more complicated gratitude of someone who understood exactly what it had cost. "Don't thank me yet," she said finally. "We still have the contract to deal with." The contract had not left her mind for a single day since she'd sat with it by the lantern that first night. She'd gone back to it twice more, each time with fresh eyes, each time arriving at the same conclusion. The interest rate written on that document was not the interest rate Elias had agreed to. Someone had altered it. The ink was wrong. The number was wrong. And the resulting debt, the impossible, crushing, ranch-destroying debt that Silas Crow now held over Elias Boone like a blade, was built entirely on that alteration. The question that had been building in the back of her mind, steady and cold as the creek in January, was this: how many other contracts looked the same? She got her answer on the 12th day, when the weather broke just enough to allow travel on the road, and a wagon appeared at the end of the lane with a neighboring rancher named Pete Alderman sitting on the bench, his face drawn tight with the particular expression of a man who is trying to look like things are fine and failing at it. Elias went out to meet him. Delilah came to the porch and listened. Pete Alderman was 40-something, with a thick red beard going grey at the edges and the kind of rough, weathered hands that told you he had never in his life done anything other than work. He had a wife and 3 children. He ran cattle on the land his father had broken before him. He owed Silas Crow's bank a debt that had somehow, impossibly, grown to $380 despite 4 years of payments that should have reduced it significantly. "I don't understand it," Pete said, turning his hat in his hands. "Martha and I have gone over the numbers every which way. I borrowed $220. Even at the rate they're charging, it shouldn't be this high. But every time I try to talk to the man at the bank, he just shows me the contract and says the numbers are right." "Can I see your contract?" Delilah asked from the porch. Both men looked at her. Pete Alderman blinked, then looked at Elias, then back at her. "She's good with numbers," Elias said simply. "Better than either of us." Pete reached inside his coat and pulled out a folded document. Delilah came down the porch steps and took it, opened it in the grey winter light, and read it with the focused attention of someone who knows exactly what they're looking for. The ink in the interest rate clause was slightly different from the rest of the document. The number that should have been a 5 looked, if you weren't examining it carefully, like a 15. "Pete," she said, keeping her voice even, "when you signed this, what interest rate did they tell you?" 5%, he said immediately. "I remember because I thought it was steep, but I needed the money and Crow's was the only bank giving loans that year after the drought." She held the contract up toward the thin winter light and tilted it slightly. "Does this look like a 5 to you, or does it look like something else?" Pete Alderman leaned in close. She watched the color leave his face. He stopped. "That's not what I signed." "No," she said. "I don't believe it is." The silence that followed had a physical weight to it. The cold wind moved through the bare aspens along the lane. One of the horses in the barn shifted its weight and stamped once. Pete Alderman stared at the contract in her hands with the expression of a man who has been carrying a rock for 4 years and has just been told the rock was put there on purpose. "Are you saying he changed it?" Pete said. His voice had gone very quiet. "After I signed?" "I'm saying the ink tells 2 different stories," Delilah answered carefully, "and I'd like to see as many contracts as possible before I say anything more certain than that." Elias was watching her from a few feet away with an expression she was beginning to recognize. The look he got when she said something that shifted the frame of a problem he thought he understood. "How many other ranchers do you know who are in the same position?" she asked Pete. Pete put his hat back on his head slowly, like a man steadying himself. "The Garrity place, the Hoffmans, old Wen Tabor over on the East Ridge, the Dupre." He paused, counting. "Maybe 8 or 9 families that I know of for certain are carrying Crow debt they can't make sense of." "I want to talk to them," Delilah said. Pete looked at Elias again. Elias spread his hand slightly, a gesture that said, as clearly as words, "She makes the decisions here." Pete looked back at her. Something in his expression shifted, not quite trust yet, but the willingness that comes just before trust, the moment when a drowning person decides to take the hand being offered. "I'll bring them to you," he said. He came back 4 days later with 6 of them. They gathered in the front room of the Boone Ranch, which was warmer now thanks to the re-chinked windows and the stove that Delilah had cleaned and tuned in her second week, and they brought their contracts. A cattle rancher named Joseph Hoffman, heavy-set and quiet, who owed $400 on a loan that should have been paid off entirely. A widow named Cora Garrity, whose husband had died the previous winter, and who was now solely responsible for a debt she had never understood and couldn't possibly meet. Old Wen Tabor, 70 years old, with a memory sharp enough to recall the exact words of every conversation he'd had about his loan. The Dupre brothers, Marcel and Henri, who had borrowed jointly and now owed jointly a debt that had somehow doubled in 2 years. Delilah sat at the kitchen table with all of their contracts spread before her, and she read each one with the same focused, methodical attention. Elias brought coffee and stood near the door. Nobody made much small talk. The room had the particular quiet of people who have been carrying something heavy and are beginning to understand for the first time that they have been carrying it together. She went through every document. She noted every discrepancy. She asked each person the same questions. What rate did they agree to verbally? Who was present? Did they receive a copy at signing or only later? The answers built a pattern as clear and damning as a column of figures that doesn't add up. Every contract in her hands had ink inconsistencies in the interest rate clause. Every person in the room had agreed verbally to a rate lower than what the contract now showed. And every altered rate, coincidentally or not, was high enough to ensure that the debt would grow faster than any working ranch in a drought year could pay it down, ensuring that the borrower would eventually fall behind, fall into default, and fall into the particular trap that Silas Crow had built for them. When she had finished with the last document, she folded her hands on the table and looked around the room. "I want to be careful about what I say," she began, "because I'm not a lawyer, and I cannot tell you with legal certainty what these documents prove. What I can tell you is what I see as someone who has spent 6 years reading financial records for a living." She paused. "What I see is that every contract in this room appears to have been altered after it was signed. The interest rates you agreed to and the interest rates now written in these contracts are not the same numbers. And the difference between those numbers accounts for the full amount of debt that none of you can explain." The room was absolutely silent for a moment. Then Cora Garrity, who had not spoken since she arrived, said in a voice that was very steady and very quiet, "My husband spent his last good year working himself half to death trying to make payments on a debt he didn't understand. He thought it was his fault. He thought he'd failed us." She stopped, started again. "It wasn't his fault?" Delilah looked at her directly. "No, Mrs. Garrity, from everything I can see in this document, it was not his fault." Cora Garrity nodded once. She looked down at the table. Her hands, folded in her lap, were very still. Joseph Hoffman leaned forward. "So, what do we do?" "We need original copies," Delilah said. "These are the copies given to borrowers after signing. The originals, the documents that were signed in the room, before anyone had a chance to alter them, those would be at the bank, in Crow's records." She looked around at them. "If those originals show different numbers than what's written here, that's not a bookkeeping error. That's fraud." "How do we get the originals?" Marcel Dupré asked. The room shifted. Several people exchanged glances. "That's what I'm working on," Delilah said. It wasn't the answer they wanted, but it was the only honest one she had. After the neighbors left, Elias bolted the front door and came back to the kitchen where Delilah was still sitting with the contracts spread before her, staring at them with the focused look he now recognized as the look she wore when she was working through something that had multiple moving parts and no obvious solution. "You're thinking about going to Crow's estate," he said. It wasn't a question. She looked up at him. "If we bring accusations to any authority in this valley with only the borrower's copies of these contracts, Crow's lawyers will say the borrowers misremembered the original terms. They'll say the ink variations are age and handling. They'll say every single one of us is either confused or lying." She tapped the stack of documents in front of her. "The originals are proof. Without them, we have a story. With them, we have a case." Elias sat down across from her. He was quiet for a long moment, studying the table. "Crow's estate is 8 miles north," he said finally. "He keeps riders on the property. The main house has a study where he conducts all his business. I've been there twice when the loans were arranged. There's a large desk and a filing cabinet behind it." She looked at him. "You'd help me do this." It wasn't quite a question either. He met her eyes across the table, and in the lamplight his expression was something she hadn't seen on him before. Not the weariness or the shame or the careful neutrality he'd worn through most of the past 2 weeks, but something steadier and more resolved. "My father built this ranch," he said. "He worked 40 years on this land. He didn't leave it to me so I could lose it to a man who cheats people in the ink." He paused. "And I've been sitting with that shame long enough. I'm done sitting." Outside, the wind moved through the valley with a low, constant sound, pressing against the newly chinked windows and finding, for the first time this winter, that they held. Delilah looked at the contracts. She looked at Elias. "Then we need to plan carefully," she said. "And we need to plan soon, before the next heavy snow makes the road to his estate impassable." She pulled a blank piece of paper from the drawer beside the table and smoothed it flat. At the top she wrote 2 words, Crow Estate. Below that, she began to write. The lantern burned steadily. The stove ticked and settled, and in the margins of the paper, in her small, precise bookkeeper's hand, the outline of something that was no longer just a plan to save one ranch began to take shape. Something larger and more dangerous and absolutely necessary. Silas Crow, 8 miles north in his warm estate with his good whiskey and his ledgers full of stolen arithmetic, had no idea that the piece he'd placed on the board was not moving the direction he'd intended. He was still thinking of her as a problem he'd already solved. The plan took 4 days to build and 1 cold, moonlit night to execute. Delilah spent those 4 days doing what she always did when a problem felt too large. She broke it into pieces small enough to hold. She drew the layout of Crow's estate from memory, or rather from the memory Elias provided, asking him to describe what he'd seen during his 2 visits in the kind of detail that most people don't bother to retain because they don't know yet that they'll need it. Elias surprised her. He remembered more than he thought he did. The long approach road lined with bare cottonwoods, the main gate, iron, kept latched but not locked during the day. The house itself, 2 stories of dressed stone and heavy timber, with the study on the ground floor to the right of the entrance hall, a room with tall windows facing the south garden, and a door that locked from the inside with a simple bar latch. The filing cabinet behind the desk, dark wood, 3 drawers. The bunkhouse for the riders set back and to the left, close enough to the main house that shouting would carry, but far enough that a careful person moving quietly would not be heard through closed walls on a windy night. Pete Alderman came back on the 3rd day, and with him came Marcel Dupre, who turned out to be the most useful person in the room, because he had worked briefly as a stable hand at the Crow estate 2 summers ago, and knew something nobody else did. There was a back entrance to the property, a service gate on the eastern side used by supply wagons, that was secured with only a rope latch, and was largely unwatched because Crow's riders did their rounds on the western perimeter where the grazing land was. "How many riders at night?" Delilah asked. "When I was there 2, Marcel said. "They switch at midnight. There's maybe 20 minutes when both shifts are at the bunkhouse at the same time." 20 minutes, Elias repeated. "It's enough," Delilah said, "if we don't waste any of it." She had decided, without announcing it as a decision, that she was going inside the house herself. Not because she was reckless. She was the least reckless person she knew, but because she was the only one who would know precisely what to look for in a filing cabinet full of documents, and the only one who could distinguish a significant alteration from ordinary paperwork in the dark by lantern light. She needed original contracts. She needed correspondence, anything that showed Crow discussing the alterations, ordering them, approving them. She needed enough that a federal court could not look away. Elias had objected to this part of the plan in the same quiet, firm way he'd started objecting to things he disagreed with. Not loudly, not with anger, but with a stillness that made it clear he had thought it through. "You're not going in alone," he said. "I wasn't planning to. I need you outside, watching the bunkhouse. If the riders move early, I need to know." "Pete can watch the bunkhouse. I'm coming inside with you." She looked at him across the table. "Elias?" "It's my ranch," he said. "My debt, my name on those contracts." He held her gaze steadily. "And if something goes wrong in there, you're not facing it by yourself." She held the argument in her mouth for a moment, then let it go. He wasn't wrong about any of it. "All right," she said, "but inside the house, you follow my lead. No improvising." "Understood." "I mean it. If I stop, you stop. If I turn back, we both turn back. No heroics." Something close to a smile crossed his face, brief and genuine. "You're the one who's been heroic since you got here. I'm just trying to keep up." She chose not to examine how that landed, and went back to the plan. They left on a Thursday night, 2 weeks into December, when the moon was 3/4 full and the sky had cleared after a 2-day storm that left the world bright and hard and silent. The temperature was well below freezing. Delilah wore every layer she could move in. Wool underlayers, her heaviest coat, a scarf pulled up over her nose, and still the cold found the gaps and settled in. Elias rode beside her on the road north. Pete and Marcel followed 50 yards behind, far enough to look like unrelated travelers if anyone passed, close enough to converge quickly if needed. Nobody passed. The road through the valley at midnight in December was as empty as the far side of the moon. The eastern service gate was exactly where Marcel had described it. A simple timber frame in the stone wall, rope-latched, hinges that Delilah had thought to bring oil for, tucked into her coat pocket in a small vial she'd prepared that afternoon. She oiled the hinges before she touched them. The gate opened without a sound. They left the horses with Pete and Marcel in the tree line and went through on foot. The estate grounds were larger than Delilah had imagined from Elias's description, broad and formally laid out in a way that felt incongruous with the rough frontier valley surrounding it, as though Crow had decided that owning this land wasn't enough, and he needed to demonstrate it architecturally as well. There were outbuildings, a proper carriage house, a stone-walled kitchen garden. The main house rose at the center of it all, windows dark except for a single lit room on the upper floor. A bedroom, probably, or a sitting room. Someone was awake up there. Delilah kept to the shadow of the carriage house and assessed. "Light upstairs," she murmured. "I see it," Elias breathed beside her. "Study is on the ground floor, south side. The lit room is north, different wing." She watched the window for 30 seconds. No movement. "We go now, while the riders are changing. Stay close." They crossed the open ground between the carriage house and the main house in the longest 30 seconds of Delilah's life, moving quickly but not running, because running was the thing that catches eyes. The south wall of the house was fully dark. The study windows she'd been told about were tall and narrow, and the middle one, as Elias had remembered, and as she had planned for, had a latch that he'd watched Crow's man open from outside with a pocket knife during a summer visit when the room had gotten too warm and the man wanted air. Her hands were steady. That surprised her slightly. She had expected fear, and it was there, but underneath it was something else. A cold, focused clarity that she recognized from the moments in her life when the stakes had been highest and the path had been narrowest. She worked the latch the way Elias had described it. Thin blade of her penknife into the gap, slight upward pressure, feeling for the catch. It released. The window swung inward without a sound. She was through it in one motion, then turned and helped Elias through behind her. And for a moment they both stood in the darkness of Silas Crow's study and just breathed. The room smelled of wood polish and tobacco, and the particular dry smell of old paper. Delilah pulled the small lantern from inside her coat. The dark lantern, its shutters closed, that she had prepared specifically for this, and opened it to the narrowest possible aperture. A thin line of light fell across the room. The desk was massive, dark walnut, exactly where Elias had said it would be. The filing cabinet stood behind it. 3 drawers, brass handles. She went to it immediately, opened the top drawer and scanned the files by the thin light. Correspondence. Bank operations. She moved to the second drawer. Loan files. Her fingers moved through them quickly, reading the tab labels in the narrow light. Alderman, Boone, Dupre, Garrity, Hoffman, Tabor. One by one she pulled them, opened each to the page with the interest rate clause, and held them to the light. Original documents. The ink was uniform, consistent, signed and dated in the original hand, and every single one of them showed interest rates dramatically lower than the numbers on the copies she had at home on her kitchen table. The difference between what these documents said and what the borrowers had been charged was not ambiguous. It was not subtle. It was the difference between a manageable debt and an impossible one, multiplied across every ranch family in the valley, calculated to ensure that no one could ever get clear. "Elias," she breathed. He was at her shoulder in a moment. She held the lantern steady and let him look at his own file, his original contract. The number that had been 4% when he signed it and was still 4% here on the original, before someone had added a careful stroke of ink to the copy he'd been handed. She watched his face in the thin light. He read the number. He looked at it for a long moment. Something moved through his expression that was not quite grief and not quite anger, but was made of both. The particular pain of a man who has been blaming himself for years for a disaster that was designed for him. "Take them all," he said very quietly. "Not all. We take the originals that correspond to the altered copies. We leave everything else exactly as we found it." She was already carefully extracting the relevant files, stacking them, keeping them in order. "If we take too much, it looks like a robbery. If we take only what we can prove we need, it looks like what it is." She moved to the desk. The drawers held correspondence, and she went through it quickly but thoroughly, looking for anything that connected Crow directly to the alterations. In the bottom left drawer, beneath a locked cash box that she left untouched, she found a folder with no label. Inside were letters, 4 of them, addressed to a man named Aldous Birch, who she did not recognize, written in a hand she would later confirm was Crow's own. She read the first one by the narrow lantern light, and felt something cold settle in her chest that had nothing to do with the winter. The letter was explicit, not carelessly so. Crow was not careless, but explicit enough. It discussed the adjustment of loan documents after signing as a mechanism for ensuring timely reversion of property assets. It named specific ranches. It discussed the timeline for foreclosure. It was the correspondence of a man who had done this deliberately, systematically, and with full understanding of what he was taking from the people whose documents he was altering. She folded the letters and added them to the stack. "We have what we need," she said. "We go." She had barely gotten the words out when the sound came. Hoofbeats. Not distant, close. Coming around the south side of the house. Elias heard it at the same moment she did. They both went completely still. The riders weren't supposed to be back for another 10 minutes. Something had changed the pattern. Maybe routine, maybe instinct, maybe simple bad luck. It didn't matter. What mattered was that the hoofbeats were slowing, which meant they were stopping, which meant someone was right outside the south wall where the study windows were. Delilah closed the lantern shutter entirely. Total darkness. She moved by memory and touch. 3 steps to the filing cabinet, she eased the drawer shut as silently as she could. 2 steps to the desk, she replaced the drawer she'd left open. She pressed the folder of letters and the stack of loan files flat against her body under her coat. A voice outside, low and indistinct. 2 riders, by the sound of it, not one. They'd come together, which was not the pattern Marcel had described. They were talking about something. She couldn't make out words through the stone wall, just the cadence of conversation, easy and unhurried, which meant they weren't alarmed, which meant they hadn't heard anything. She found Elias's arm in the dark, pressed her hand against it once, wait, and felt him go still beside her. They stood in the absolute darkness of Crow's study for what felt like a very long time and was probably 2 minutes. The voices outside continued their unhurried conversation. One of the riders laughed at something. Then the hoofbeats resumed, moving away, going around to the front of the house. Delilah let out a breath she'd been holding so long her chest ached. "Window," she said, barely audible. They were through it in seconds. She pulled it shut behind her, easing the latch back into place by feel, and then they were moving across the open ground toward the carriage house shadow. Not running, still not running, even though every instinct was screaming at her to run. They made the shadow of the carriage house. She pressed her back against the stone wall and looked back at the house. The upstairs window was still lit. The study windows were dark and still. No alarm, no shout, nothing. Elias was breathing hard beside her. "The riders changed their pattern," she said. "Doesn't matter now. We move to the gate. We should go around the north side, away from where they went." "Agreed. You lead." He led. She followed with the documents pressed against her heart under her coat, feeling the paper through the wool, solid and real and impossibly valuable. They moved along the north wall of the estate, through a kitchen garden where the bare stems of dormant plants caught at their boots, to the service gate on the eastern side, through the gate, into the tree line. Pete Alderman appeared from behind a pine tree with a look of profound relief on his face. "You were gone 40 minutes, he said. I was about to—" "We're out," Elias said. "Let's ride." They rode hard for the first 2 miles, until the Crow estate was well behind them and the road curved down into a hollow where the tree cover was dense enough to muffle sound. Then Delilah raised her hand and they slowed to a walk, because hard-ridden horses on a cold night could founder, and she was not going to lose a horse after surviving everything else. It was Marcel who broke the silence, pulling his horse alongside hers. "Did you find something?" he asked. She reached inside her coat and drew out the stack of files, holding them where he could see even in the moonlight. "Original contracts," she said. "All of them. And correspondence from Crow himself confirming the alterations were deliberate." She looked at him, then at Pete, then at Elias riding on her other side. "What he did to your family, Marcel, to all of your families. It's in here, in his own handwriting." Marcel Dupré said nothing for a moment. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, and he had been quiet through most of the planning and the ride and the waiting. But now, in the moonlight, on the road back through the valley that Crow had spent years systematically robbing, she saw his jaw work once, and his eyes go bright with something that was equal parts grief and fury, and something harder to name. "My father died thinking he'd failed us," he said. "Thought he wasn't smart enough to manage money, spent his last 2 years ashamed of himself." He looked at the documents in her hands. He wasn't stupid. He was robbed. "He was robbed," Delilah said. "And now we have the proof." They rode the rest of the way back in silence, and the silence was not empty. It was full of the weight of what they were carrying, not just the documents, though the documents were everything, but the knowledge that the story had just changed shape. That what had begun months ago as a cruel arrangement designed to break 2 people had become something Silas Crow had never anticipated, and would not see coming until it was far too late to stop. When they reached the ranch, and Delilah finally swung down from the saddle and felt the frozen ground under her boots, Elias was there beside her. He reached out and steadied her arm, not because she needed steadying, but in the way of someone who wants to mark a moment without knowing how else to do it. "You did it," he said. She looked down at the documents in her hands, then up at the sky, which was enormous and cold and scattered with more stars than she'd ever seen from the city. "We did it," she said, "but we're not finished." She went inside and put the documents in the locked box under the desk, her box now, brought with her from Coldwell, the only thing she'd insisted on keeping close. She locked it. She put the key in her pocket. She sat down at the kitchen table in the dark for a moment, not lighting the lamp, just sitting with the stillness of the house around her, and the reality of what had just happened settling into her bones alongside the cold. 8 miles north, in the stone house with one lit window, Silas Crow did not yet know that his study had been visited. He did not yet know that the careful, systematic fraud he had built across an entire valley over years of patient predatory work had been found, documented, and carried away into the winter dark by a woman he had dismissed as a piece on a board he would know soon. And when he did, the cold that had settled into Delilah Mercer's bones on the ride home would become the least of anyone's worries. She sat in the dark kitchen of a ranch that was no longer just a failing property, but the center of something that was going to shake Blackstone Ridge to its foundations, and she held the key to the locked box in her closed fist, and she thought about the road ahead, Mladiche, long and dangerous and frozen solid with winter, and found, somewhere underneath the fear and the exhaustion, a quality she had almost forgotten she possessed: certainty. Not the brittle certainty of someone who has never been beaten, the deeper kind, the certainty of someone who has been beaten, who knows exactly how it feels, and who has decided that it ends here. She got up, lit the lamp, and began writing the letter that would carry everything north to the federal marshal's office in the morning. The letter took her 2 hours to write and 3 drafts to get right. Not because she didn't know what to say, she knew exactly what to say, but because she understood, with the precision of someone who had spent years working with documents, that a letter asking a federal marshal to investigate the most powerful man in a frontier valley needed to be constructed with the same care as the evidence it described. Too emotional, and it would be dismissed as grievance. Too dry, and the urgency would be lost. She needed it to read the way the contracts read, factual, specific, and impossible to explain away. She described the pattern of altered documents. She listed the names of the affected families and the discrepancies between their original contracts and the copies they'd been given. She referenced the correspondence from Crow to Aldous Birch, quoting 2 specific phrases that were damning enough to demand attention without revealing everything she held. She noted that the evidence was in her possession, secured, and available for examination by any federal officer who came to Blackstone Ridge prepared to operate outside the influence of local authorities. That last sentence was deliberate. She wanted whoever read the letter to understand that the local sheriff was not the appropriate contact. She wanted federal eyes, federal jurisdiction, federal authority that Crow's money and connections could not reach. She sealed the letter. She put the documents, originals and correspondence both, into a second sealed packet wrapped in oilcloth and tied with cord. She wrote the address of the federal marshal's office in Harlow City on both in her clearest hand. Then she went to bed, slept 4 hours, and rose before dawn. Elias was already up. He was standing at the stove with 2 cups of coffee, and when she came downstairs fully dressed with her coat on and the locked box under her arm, he held one out to her without saying anything. She took it, drank half of it standing at the kitchen window looking out at the pre-dawn dark. "I'm going to ride to Millhaven to post these," she said. "Not Blackstone Ridge. Millhaven is 22 miles, but it's outside the county, and I don't trust the post office here not to flag the address to someone connected to Crow." "I know," he said. "I'm coming with you." She started to object, caught herself, and didn't. The road to Millhaven in December was not a road she needed to be on alone, and she had learned by now that accepting help from Elias Boone was not weakness. It was sense. They rode out as the sky was turning pale at its edges, and they made Millhaven by mid-morning, and she posted the letters herself, standing at the counter of a post office she had never visited before and would likely never visit again, watching the postmaster stamp them with the focused attention of someone ensuring that a thing is actually done. Then they rode home through the winter country, mostly in silence, the kind of silence that has settled past discomfort into something almost companionable. "How long before we hear back?" Elias asked, somewhere on the road between Millhaven and the valley. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Federal processes move at their own pace. Could be 2 weeks, could be 6. And in the meantime, we do not tell anyone outside the families involved what we've done or what we have. Not a word." She looked at him sidelong. Crow will notice eventually that documents are missing from his study. When he does, he'll look for whoever was close enough and motivated enough to take them. We need to not look like what we are. Which is? People who have already won, she said quietly. We just can't act like it yet. He thought about that for a moment. You're certain we've won? She felt the oilcloth packet against her ribs under her coat. The letters in the post office already making their way north. I'm certain we have the truth, she said. Whether that's the same as winning depends on who's listening. The response came in 17 days. It arrived not as a letter, but as a man. A federal investigator named Caldwell Reese, who appeared at the end of the ranch lane one January morning on a grey horse with a federal badge on his coat, and a face that suggested he had ridden through worse weather than this and found none of it particularly impressive. He was perhaps 50, compact, with the watchful eyes of someone who spent his professional life assessing people quickly and accurately. He tied his horse at the post, came to the door, and identified himself before Delilah had finished opening it. Miss Mercer, he said, your letter was specific enough that my office considered it urgent. I'd like to see the evidence you described. She stepped back to let him in. Come in out of the cold, Mr. Reese. The coffee is hot. She watched him read through everything at the kitchen table, the same table where she had first spread the contracts weeks ago, the same lamp burning against the winter grey outside the window. He read methodically and without expression, in the way of someone professionally trained not to show reaction. But she was trained in her own way, and she watched the small things. The slight tightening around his eyes when he read Crow's letters to Aldous Birch, the fractional pause before he turned the page on the third original contract, the moment when he set the last document down and was quiet for a full 10 seconds before he spoke. How many families? He asked. 9 that I've confirmed directly, she said. Pete Alderman, Marcel and Henri Dupre, Joseph Hoffman, Cora Garrity, Wen Tabor, and 4 others whose contracts are in that stack. But the pattern suggests it could be as many as 15 or 20 across the broader valley. And the man named Birch in the correspondence, do you know who he is? I don't, but the letters are addressed to Harlow City, and the handwriting on the responses, she pulled out the reply letters she'd found in the folder, is different from Crow's, which suggests Birch is a collaborator rather than an employee. Reese looked at her with a quality of attention she recognized as professional respect, the kind that gets extended when someone demonstrates competence rather than being offered as a social courtesy. You've done careful work here, Bis. Diggy for a head, he said. I'm a bookkeeper, she said. Careful work is what I know. You're more than a bookkeeper, he said, and looked back at the documents. I'll need to take the originals. I know, I made copies. She set a second stack on the table, her own handwritten reproductions, line by line, every clause, every signature, every date. Not admissible, I understand that, but if anything happens to the originals in transit, I have the record of what they said. Reese looked at the copies, then at her. How long did that take you? 3 nights, she said. I'm a fast writer. He almost smiled. It was brief and professional, but genuine. I'll need to interview the affected families before I go. Can you arrange that? I already have, she said. They're expecting you this afternoon. What followed was not swift. Justice rarely was, she had learned. Not the real kind, not the kind that reaches deep enough to matter. It moved in stages, the way a frozen river breaks up in spring, one section giving way at a time until the whole thing was in motion and impossible to stop. Reese spent 3 days in the valley, interviewing families, examining properties, taking statements. He was thorough and impartial and gave nothing away, but the fact of his presence, a federal badge moving through Blackstone Ridge, asking questions, writing things down, was not something that could be kept quiet. By the second day, Delilah knew from Pete Alderman's wife that word had reached Crow. By the third day, she knew from old Wen Tabor that Crow had ridden into town and spent 3 hours behind closed doors with the local sheriff and the county judge. He's moving to protect himself, Elias said that evening. Of course he is, she said. He's been moving pieces on this board for years. He knows how to play defense. She was at the kitchen table again, where she seemed to spend most of her significant moments working through the implications. The question is whether Reese moves faster than Crow's local network can react. He did, barely. The formal federal investigation opened 6 days after Reese left the valley, and with it came a notice to the county sheriff that jurisdiction over any matters related to the Crow Bank and its loan portfolio was being assumed at the federal level pending investigation. The sheriff, a man named Alt who had taken more than occasional hospitality from Silas Crowe over the years, received this notice and did nothing, which was, under the circumstances, the most useful thing he could have done. Crowe's first move was predictable. He hired lawyers from the capital, 3 of them, expensive with the particular smoothness of men who had spent careers making difficult things disappear. They filed a motion challenging the admissibility of the documents on the grounds that they had been obtained without authorization from private property. It was a reasonable legal argument, Reese's supervisor wrote in the letter he sent to Delilah, and it would need to be addressed, which meant that the investigation would likely go to a federal hearing before it went to trial. She read that letter 3 times. "They're going to make us testify," she told Elias, "in a federal proceeding, in front of Crowe's lawyers. Will that be a problem?" She folded the letters carefully. "It will be uncomfortable," she said. "They'll challenge how the documents were obtained. They'll question my credibility. They'll try to make the story about me rather than about what's in those contracts." She set the letter down. "But the documents are what they are. The ink is what it is. You can attack the messenger all you want. It doesn't change the arithmetic." "Are you afraid?" he asked. She considered being dishonest about it and decided against it. "Yes," she said. "A certain amount of fear is appropriate. What I'm not is deterred." He nodded slowly, in the way she had come to understand meant he was satisfied with an answer. Not because it was reassuring, but because it was true. The hearing was set for February, in the federal courthouse at Harlow City, 60 miles north of Blackstone Ridge through mountain roads that were at their worst in February. Delilah and Elias made the journey in 2 days, with Pete Alderman and Joseph Hoffman riding with them, the 2 whose statements were considered most critical, and old Wen Tabor, who had insisted on coming despite the cold and the distance and his 70 years, and who rode the entire way without complaint with the particular stubbornness of a man who has been wronged and intends to say so in the appropriate setting. "You don't have to make this trip, Wen," Delilah had told him the morning they left. "Yes, I do," he said simply. He pulled his coat tighter and clicked to his horse. She didn't argue. Harlow City was larger than Blackstone Ridge and colder at altitude. A proper town with brick buildings and a federal courthouse that sat on the main street, with the particular gravity of structures built to communicate permanence. They arrived on a grey afternoon with snow threatening and checked into a boarding house that was clean and adequately heated, and which Delilah paid for with money she had been setting aside since November from the small household allowance she'd extracted from the ranch accounts with Elias's agreement. That evening, Reese came to the boarding house to prepare them. He sat with Delilah and Elias in the small front parlor and went through what the hearing would look like, who would be there, what Crowe's lawyers were likely to argue. He was direct about the challenges. The question of how the documents had been obtained was real and would be pressed. The defense would argue that the chain of custody was compromised, that Delilah had no legal standing to remove materials from private property, that the entire evidentiary package should be thrown out. "And what's the answer to that?" Elias asked. "The answer," Reese said, "is that federal investigators are not bound by the same evidentiary constraints as local law enforcement in cases of ongoing fraud where the evidence is at imminent risk of destruction." He looked at Delilah. "The answer is also that once the investigation was open, we conducted our own independent examination of the documents you provided, cross-referenced them against bank records subpoenaed separately, and confirmed the alterations through independent forensic analysis. Your removal of the documents was the catalyst. The federal case rests on our independent findings." "So what I did was," she began. "Technically complicated," Reese said carefully. "But you are not the one on trial here. Silas Crowe is." She held on to that. The hearing the next morning was everything Reese had prepared them for, and a few things he hadn't mentioned, probably because he thought she could handle the surprises better without advance warning. The room was formal and cold, with high ceilings and the kind of institutional wood paneling that absorbed sound and gave everything a muffled, serious quality. Crowe's 3 lawyers sat at a long table to one side, and Crowe himself sat with them, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, composed in the way of a man who has always been the most powerful person in any room he's entered and sees no reason to expect this room to be different. He looked at Delilah when she entered. It was a brief look, controlled and assessing, and what she read in it was not fear, but recalibration. The same look she'd first seen on Elias's face. That quick inventory and adjustment. But where Elias had landed on shame, Crowe landed on something colder. He landed on contempt, very quickly covered. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, then looked away and took her seat. The lead federal examiner, a woman named Hargrove who wore her grey hair pinned back with the no-nonsense efficiency of someone who had argued her way through 100 hearings and found the process neither intimidating nor particularly interesting, called the session to order and began. Crow's lawyers were good, she had to acknowledge that. They moved through their arguments with a practiced fluency, attacking the provenance of the documents, questioning the chain of custody, suggesting that a woman of Delilah's position and motive had ample reason to fabricate or manipulate financial records. The word bookkeeper was deployed with a particular inflection, as though the occupation itself implied capacity for fraud. They questioned her relationship to the affected ranchers, implied coordination and conspiracy among the debtor families, and at one point suggested, with studied indirection, that a woman who had arrived in the valley under the unusual circumstances of an arranged marriage was perhaps not the most credible source on matters of financial integrity. Delilah sat through all of it with her hands flat on the table in front of her and her face as neutral as she could hold it, because she had known this would happen and she had decided in advance how she would carry herself through it, not above it, not visibly wounded by it, but steady, present, immovable. When it was her turn to respond to questions from Hargrove's side, she answered each one with the same direct, factual precision she would have used going over accounts with a client. She described what she had found in the contracts. She described the ink variations. She described her methodology for confirming the alterations and the process by which she had gathered testimony from the affected families. She spoke about Crow's letters to Aldous Birch with the same flat clarity she would have used reading numbers from a column. At one point, Crow's lead attorney leaned forward with the expression of a man delivering a finishing blow. "Miss Mercer," he said, "is it not true that you entered my client's private estate without permission and removed documents from his personal files?" The room was very quiet. "I removed evidence of a crime from the location where it was being concealed," she said. "Whether the law considers those the same action is what this hearing is here to determine. What I can tell you is what I found, and what the independent federal forensic examination of those documents subsequently confirmed." She looked at him steadily. "If the question is whether I was afraid to do what needed doing, no, I was not. Some things are worth the risk." There was a quality to the silence after that which she had rarely experienced and recognized immediately. The silence of a room that has just shifted. Hargrove looked at her over the top of her papers with an expression that was not quite approval and not quite surprise, but was made of elements of both. The hearing ran for 2 days. On the second afternoon, Hargrove called a recess and did not say when it would reconvene. Delilah sat in the cold corridor outside the hearing room, on a wooden bench with Elias beside her and Pete Alderman across from her, and old Wen Tabor at the end, all of them quiet, all of them waiting. Wen Tabor broke the silence after a long while. "When I was young," he said to no one in particular, his voice slow and unhurried as everything about him, "my father told me that the only thing that matters when you've been wronged is whether you're willing to stand up and say so in front of the people who have the power to fix it. He said most people aren't because it costs too much." He paused. He didn't say anything about it being easy. He said it was worth it. Nobody responded to that, but nobody needed to. The ruling came the following morning, and it was not the final verdict. That would take months, a full trial, the formal prosecution of Silas Crow, and the unraveling of his financial network piece by piece. But it was the ruling that mattered most. Hargrove found that the federal investigation had independent standing, that the forensic evidence of document alteration was admissible, that the testimony of the affected families was credible and consistent, and that there was sufficient cause to proceed to full federal prosecution. Crow's lawyers filed 3 immediate objections. Hargrove overruled them in the same tone she had used throughout: efficient, untroubled, utterly unmoved. Crow himself sat at the table, and for the first time since the hearing began, Delilah watched something shift in his composed, silver-haired face. It was small and brief and quickly controlled, the way all his reactions were, but it was there. It was the first time, she suspected, that he had sat in a room where the outcome was not something he had arranged in advance. She did not smile. She didn't allow herself that. There was still too much ahead. The trial, the testimony, the months of process that stood between this moment and the day when those fraudulent debts were officially and permanently erased. She knew better than to celebrate early. But she allowed herself, sitting on the hard wooden bench in the corridor of the Harlow City Federal Courthouse with snow falling outside the high windows, one quiet moment of something that was not quite triumph and not quite relief, but lived in the space between them. Elias found her there. He sat down beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, and he didn't say anything for a long while. Then he said, quietly, "My father's ranch." "Still standing," she said. "Still standing," he agreed. Outside, the snow continued to fall, steady and clean and indifferent to the machinations of men, and the long, grinding work of justice. And somewhere in the courthouse behind them, Silas Crowe was meeting with his lawyers. And the meeting was not going well, and the empire he had built on altered ink, and manufactured debt was beginning at last to show the first hairline fractures of its collapse. It would not happen all at once. These things never did. But it had started. And Delilah Mercer, who had arrived in Blackstone Ridge in chains she couldn't see, sat in the corridor of a federal courthouse with snow on her coat and evidence in the record and the long road home still ahead of her, and understood with the certainty of someone who has earned her clarity that it had started because she had refused, at every turn and at every cost, to let it be otherwise. The road home from Harlow City took 2 days, and for most of it, nobody talked much. That was all right. Delilah had learned, in the months since she'd arrived in Blackstone Ridge on a groaning wagon with a trunk and a private promise, that silence between people who have been through something together is not the same as silence between strangers. The silence on the road home was the silence of people who had said the hard things in the hard places, and now didn't need to fill the air with words just to prove they were still present. Pete Alderman rode at the front of the small group and occasionally sang to himself under his breath, old working songs that had no particular tune. Wen Taba rode at the back with the unhurried steadiness of a man who had been 70 years old for a while now, and had made his peace with the pace of things. Joseph Hoffman rode in the middle and said almost nothing the entire way, and seemed, for the first time since Delilah had met him, to have the look of a man whose shoulders had been relieved of something very heavy. Elias rode beside her. He did that naturally now, without arranging it, the way people fall into patterns that stop being choices and become simply the way things are. Somewhere on the second day, as the mountains of Blackstone Ridge came back into view against the winter sky, he said, "Whatever happens next, I want you to know that whatever you decide about staying or going, it doesn't change what you've done here." She looked at him. The wind off the mountain was cold and direct and smelled of pine and coming snow. "What makes you think I'm thinking about going here?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know that you are. I just know that you were brought here against your will, and you've never been given a real choice about any of it. And I thought someone should say out loud that you have one now." She looked back at the road ahead. The mountains were grey-blue and enormous against the pale sky, and the valley below them was white and wide and quieter than anywhere she had ever lived before. She thought about Coldwell, where she had kept books for a man who had eventually handed her over to settle a debt. She thought about the boarding houses and the limited prospects and the life that had been assembled around her by the decisions of other people. She thought about chinked window frames and sisted barn beams and a kitchen table where the truth had been laid out and examined and refused to stay buried. "I'll let you know when I've decided," she said, "but I'm not going anywhere before the trial." He nodded and said nothing more about it. The trial proper began in March and lasted 11 days. It was not the kind of courtroom drama that moves quickly or resolves itself in a single electric moment. It was slower and more grinding than that. The systematic dismantling of a fraudulent enterprise that had been built over years required years' worth of documentation to unravel, and the federal prosecutors who had taken Reese's investigation and built a case from it were methodical people who did not move faster than the evidence could support. Crowe's lawyers fought every step. They challenged witnesses, questioned documents, filed motions that delayed proceedings by hours and occasionally days. They were very good at their work, and there were moments sitting in that courtroom when Delilah could feel the weight of the machine Crowe had spent decades building. The money, the influence, the network of people who owed him favors and feared him more than they feared perjury. But the evidence was what it was. Aldous Birch, the man named in Crowe's letters, was located in Harlow City, where he had been operating as a private document notary. A man who had access to the appropriate inks, the appropriate tools, the appropriate technical knowledge to alter a signed contract without creating obvious seams. When federal investigators arrived at his office with a warrant, they found, in a locked drawer of his own desk, a ledger recording payments received for document services rendered to the Crow Bank over a period of 6 years. The ledger listed dates, it listed amounts, it listed, in a cramped but legible hand, the initials of the loan documents that had been sent to him for modification. Every initial in that ledger corresponded to a name Delilah had already put in front of Reese months ago. When Birch was offered a reduced sentence in exchange for testimony, he accepted within 24 hours. Crow's composure, which had held through the Harlow City hearing with the practiced serenity of a man who believed himself untouchable, began to show its cracks on the 4th day of trial when Birch took the stand. Delilah watched from her seat in the gallery. She had testified on day 2, calmly and in detail, and had survived the cross-examination with the same flat steadiness she'd brought to everything. And she watched Crow's face as his former associate described the arrangement in plain language. The system by which loan documents were sent from the bank, altered at Birch's office, and returned with numbers that ensured the borrowers could never get clear. The expression on Crow's face during Birch's testimony was something she would carry with her for a long time. Not rage, not fear. Something more complicated, and in some ways more satisfying. The expression of a man who has operated for so long in a world he controlled that he genuinely had not believed this moment was possible. The expression of someone confronting for the first time a force he hadn't accounted for. She had been that force. She and Elias and Pete and Marcel and Joseph and Cora Garrity and old Wen Taba and all the rest of them, ordinary people with ordinary lives that had been methodically stolen from them by a man who had calculated that they were too scattered and too desperate and too beaten down to fight back. He had been wrong. On the 9th day, Cora Garrity took the stand. She was small and quiet and dressed in her best, which was not particularly fine, and she answered every question in the careful, steady voice of a woman who has been preparing to say these things for a long time. When the prosecutor asked her to describe the effect of the fraudulent debt on her family, she folded her hands in her lap and looked at the room and said, without drama and without tears, "My husband worked himself into the ground trying to make payments on a debt that was never going to let him go. He thought he'd failed us. He died thinking it was his fault. It wasn't his fault," she paused. "I want that on the record. I want it in writing somewhere that it was not his fault." The courtroom was very quiet after that. Even Crow's lawyers did not cross-examine her at length. The verdict came on the 11th day, in the early afternoon, with grey winter light coming through the courthouse windows and every seat in the gallery filled with people who had driven or ridden or walked from the valley and the surrounding territory to be there. The jury had deliberated for less than 4 hours, which Reese had told Delilah privately was a sign that the case had not left them much room for doubt. Silas Crow was found guilty on 14 counts of financial fraud, 7 counts of deliberate document falsification, and 3 counts of conspiracy to deprive citizens of lawful property rights. The judge, a federal appointee who had been imported specifically because every local judicial figure in the territory was considered potentially compromised, read the verdict in a measured, even voice, and then set sentencing for 2 weeks hence. The courtroom erupted. Not into cheering exactly. It was a courtroom, and there were marshals, and people mostly kept themselves contained, but into the specific loud relief of a crowd that has been holding its breath for a very long time and has finally been given permission to breathe. Delilah sat in the gallery with Elias on one side and Pete Alderman on the other, and she felt the sound of it move through her like a wave, and she pressed her lips together and looked at her hands in her lap and did not cry, because she had made herself a promise and she intended to keep it. She came very close. Pete Alderman put his large hand over hers on the bench armrest, briefly and without ceremony, and said nothing. That was sufficient. Elias leaned slightly toward her and said, quietly, under the noise of the room, "Your father was wrong." She looked at him. "He said you were the surviving kind," he said. "He was wrong. You're both." She looked back at her hands, took a breath. "He did the best he could with what he understood," she said. "People usually do." It was the most generous thing she had ever said about her father, and she surprised herself by meaning it. The sentences came 2 weeks later, and with them the formal orders that the federal investigators had been building toward since Reese first arrived in Blackstone Ridge with his grey horse and his watchful eyes. Crow received 8 years in federal prison. Aldous Birch received 3, reduced in exchange for his testimony. The county sheriff, Alt, was removed from office pending investigation into the favors he had accepted and the complaints he had ignored over the years. 2 members of the town council were censured. A bank examiner was dispatched to review the full portfolio of the Crow Bank, and the bank was placed under federal receivership pending that review. And then, the thing that all of it had been building toward, the thing that Delilah had written in her first careful letter to the federal marshal's office as the fundamental injustice requiring remedy. The fraudulent debts were officially and permanently erased. Every family in the valley that had been carrying debt built on an altered contract received a formal document declaring the debt null and void. The overpayments they had made over the years against interest rates they had never agreed to were calculated, and a portion of Crow's seized assets was set aside for restitution. It would not return what had been lost in years of grinding poverty and back-breaking work and sleepless nights and shame that should never have been theirs to carry. It could not return Thomas Garrity, or the years Marcel and Henri Dupre's father had spent blaming himself for a debt that had been designed to destroy him. But it was something. It was the thing that matters when the law works the way it is supposed to work. The acknowledgement in plain language on an official document that what had been done was wrong and that the record was being corrected. Delilah read the debt erasure order for the Boone Ranch 3 times on the morning it arrived. Sitting at the kitchen table with the early spring light coming through the windows she had chinked in December, which had held all winter without a single gap forming. Elias was outside. She could hear him in the yard, the sound of him working, the ring of a tool against something metal, the creak of the barn door, the particular sounds of a man who has been given back his future and is making use of it. She folded the document carefully, put it back in its envelope, and went outside. The world had changed, while none of them were entirely watching. March had happened, and then the first week of April, and the valley had begun the long exhale from winter that always seemed slightly miraculous to someone who had lived through the freeze. The way the brown returned to color, the way the creek came back up with snowmelt and ran fast and loud over its stones, the way the bare aspens along the eastern edge of the property had started showing the very first green of new leaves, tentative and small and absolutely certain. Elias was at the fence line on the south pasture, replacing a post that had heaved in the frost. He had his coat off despite the cool air, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, and he was working with the concentrated efficiency she had come to know well. Not rushed, not showy, just steady and complete. He looked up when she came across the yard, read something in her face. "It came?" he said. She held up the envelope. He set down his tools and came to meet her at the fence. She handed him the envelope. He opened it, read the document standing in the spring morning, and she watched his face the way she had watched it that first night by the lantern, looking for what came after the surface expression, the thing underneath. What she saw was simple and complicated at once. A man being handed back something that should never have been taken. A man who had lived under the weight of a manufactured failure for so long that the lifting of it looked, briefly, like grief. The way relief sometimes does when it comes after too long a wait. He folded the document and was quiet for a moment. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she confirmed. He looked out over the south pasture, where the first tentative new grass was coming up through the old dead growth, and she looked with him, and neither of them said anything for a while. "I want to plant the north field this year," he said finally. "It's been fallow 3 seasons. With the debt cleared, we have capital enough for seed, and if the spring holds fair..." "I've already been looking at yield estimates," she said. He turned to look at her. "For winter wheat," she said. "The soil composition in the north field, based on what you've described, is well suited. If we plant in the second week of May, we should clear before the first frost with a reasonable margin." She paused. "I wrote it up. It's on the table inside." He looked at her for a long moment with the creek running loud behind him and the aspens showing their new green along the fence line. "You're staying," he said. It was not quite a statement and not quite a question. She had been thinking about it since the road home from Harlow City, since he had told her she had a choice, and she had not been able to answer him immediately, because the answer required her to look at what she actually wanted, rather than what circumstances had arranged for her. She had spent a great deal of her life moving around inside circumstances arranged by other people. She had learned these past months that she was capable of arranging her own. And what she had arranged, when she looked honestly at it, was this: a ranch with good bones, A barn that would not fall on the livestock. Windows that held against the winter. A north field that had been fallow too long and was ready for something new. A community of people who had stood beside her in a courthouse and would have her back on this land the same way she had had theirs. And a man who had looked at her that first night on the porch when she arrived as an unwanted piece on someone else's board and landed on shame rather than dismissal. Who had handed her coffee in the dark before dawn without being asked? Who had said, in a federal courthouse corridor while snow fell outside, "My father's ranch," and meant it as a declaration rather than a lament? "I'm staying," she said. The relief on his face was not the performed relief of someone who had been worried about an outcome. It was simpler and more unguarded than that, the relief of someone who had wanted something and had not allowed himself to count on it. "Good," he said. And then, because he was not a man who over-decorated his feelings, "That's good, Delilah." "Don't make it sentimental," she said. "I have yield estimates to go over." He almost laughed. She was learning to read the almost laughs and count them among the better moments. They went inside together, and the door closed behind them on a spring morning that was still young, and on the table was a piece of paper covered in her small, precise numbers. Projections and estimates and carefully reasoned plans for a future that had not existed 6 months ago, when a cruel man had placed a piece on a board he thought he controlled. The community came back to them in the weeks that followed, not all at once, but in the way communities return to people who have earned their place, gradually, practically, in the form of things that needed doing. Pete Alderman arrived one Saturday morning with 3 of his sons and the lumber to rebuild the south fence entirely, refusing any payment except dinner. Joseph Hoffman sent 2 of his best cattle to winter over on Boonland, a gesture of trust that required no explanation. Marcel Dupre spent a weekend helping Elias grade the access road to the north field so it would drain properly in spring rain. Cora Garrity came with seedlings she had started in her window in February, tomatoes and early greens, and she and Delilah spent an afternoon in the kitchen garden, marking out rows in the newly turned soil, and they talked about Thomas Garrity and about the debt, and about the particular quality of anger that eventually, if you're lucky, becomes something you can put down. "Do you still think about it?" Delilah asked. "Every day," Cora said simply. "But it's different now. Before, when I thought about it, I felt alone, like it was just us, just me and the children, against something too big to fight." She pressed a seedling into the earth and smoothed the soil around it. "Now when I think about it, I think about all of us. All the families. I think about you coming to the door with that look on your face, like you already knew something was wrong, and you were just working out the details." She smiled, which was something Delilah had not seen her do before. It changed her face entirely. It doesn't feel as heavy when you're carrying it with people. Old Wen Tabor rode out the last Saturday of April, which was a warmer day than any they'd had yet, with the mountains showing their snow line receding up toward the peaks and the valley below them green and beginning. He tied his horse and sat on the porch bench that Delilah had rebuilt in January and accepted the coffee she brought him and looked out over the property with the calm survey of a man who has watched this valley for 7 decades and keeps his own counsel about what he sees. "The North Field," he said after a while. "Winter wheat," she said. "Second week of May." He nodded slowly. "Good soil up there. My father used to say it was the best drained bottomland in the valley." He turned his cup in his hands. "You've done well by this place." "The place had good bones," she said. "It just needed some attention." He looked at her sidelong with the particular humor of the very old, which is dry and unsentimental and entirely genuine. "I wasn't just talking about the place," he said. She looked out at the yard, where Elias was working the near pasture with one of the horses, the sound of him carrying across the spring morning. "He had good bones too," she said. Wen made a sound that was close to a laugh and sipped his coffee. The planting happened the second week of May, exactly as she'd planned. 8 neighboring families came to help. Not because anyone asked them, but because this was what communities did when they remembered how, when the thing that had been isolating them and grinding them down was finally, officially gone. They came with their own tools and their own lunches packed, and they worked the north field in 2 long days that left everyone's backs aching, and the field turned and seeded and raked and done. The evening of the second day, someone built a fire in the yard, and Pete Alderman produced a fiddle from somewhere, and for a few hours in the spring dark with the mountains overhead and the creek running its old steady course through the aspens, the people of Blackstone Ridge sat around a fire together for the first time in as long as most of them could remember doing it without the shadow of something hanging over the gathering. Delilah sat slightly apart, as she sometimes did, not from unfriendliness, but from the old habit of observing, of taking inventory, of reading the room the way she read a ledger. She watched Cora Garrity's youngest daughter fall asleep against her mother's arm. She watched Marcel Dupré teach Joseph Hoffman's teenage son a card trick that the boy immediately used to beat Marcel at his own game. She watched old Wen Tabor sit with his eyes closed and his face turned slightly toward the fire and his lips moving almost imperceptibly to the tune Pete was playing, as though the music was finding something in him that he kept mostly quiet. Elias came and sat beside her in the way he always did now, not asking, not arranging, just coming to where she was, as though that was simply where he was supposed to be. They sat together in the firelight and the spring dark and listened to the fiddle and the creak and the low voices of people who had been through something and come out the other side of it still standing. "The wheat will be up in 3 weeks," she said eventually. "I know," he said. "The south fence needs one more post before it's sound." "I know that too." "The barn roof should be properly re-shingled before next winter. Not patched. Re-shingled. I've been pricing the materials." He turned to look at her in the firelight. The almost laugh was there, and this time it made it all the way. "Delilah," he said. "What?" "It's a Saturday night. There's music. You're allowed to stop working for an hour." She considered this. "I'm not working," she said. "I'm planning. They're different." "Are they?" She looked at the fire, at the people around it, at the north field in the dark beyond the fence where the seed was already in the ground and the spring soil was warm enough to start its slow, reliable work. "No," she admitted. "Not really." He reached over and put his hand over hers where it rested on the ground between them, the same way Pete had done in the courthouse gallery when the verdict came, brief and without ceremony, except that Elias left his hand there. She turned her palm up and held it. They sat that way while Pete played and the fire burned and the valley settled into its spring night around them. The same valley that had been held under the thumb of a man who had believed that owning the debt meant owning the people. The same valley where the ranching families had spent years diminished and isolated and separated from each other by the manufactured shame of manufactured failures. The same valley that was, tonight, in the first warm dark of May, simply itself again, wide and cold at the edges and full of people who had remembered the hard way what they were capable of when they refused to quit. It had taken one winter, one woman who read the ink and recognized the lie, one man who had been humbled enough to say yes when someone offered to look at the problem differently, a community of ordinary, weathered, stubborn people who had been waiting without knowing it, for someone to show them that the thing they had been told was inevitable was not inevitable at all. Delilah Mercer had arrived in Blackstone Ridge as a piece on a board. She had arrived in the dark, in the cold, on a wagon that groaned with every frozen rut, told to manage a failing property and not ask too many questions and make the best of what she'd been given. She had asked every question. She had made something, not from what she'd been given, but from what she had refused to accept. The fire burned lower. Pete's fiddle found a slower tune, something old and quiet that settled over the gathering like the night itself. One by one, people began to make their way to their horses and their wagons, calling their good nights across the yard, their voices easy and unhurried in the spring dark. Cora Garrity passed by on her way to her wagon with her sleeping daughter in her arms, and she paused and looked at Delilah with the expression of someone who has found the right words after a long search and is finally ready to say them. "Thank you," she said. Not the automatic gratitude of courtesy, the other kind, weighted and specific and meant for a particular thing that would not be forgotten. Delilah nodded once. "He would have been proud of you," she said, "standing up in that courtroom the way you did." Cora pressed her lips together, held her daughter a little tighter, and walked onto a wagon. The yard grew quiet. The fire settled into coals. The mountains stood in their old dark shapes against the stars, and the creek kept its own counsel, the way it always had, running through the aspens in the dark with or without anyone to hear it. Elias banked the fire, and Delilah went inside and lit the lamp in the kitchen, and the light fell yellow and warm across the table where so much of this had begun. The contracts spread out in the lamplight, the numbers that didn't match, The first careful words of a plan written on the back of an envelope when the world was frozen solid and the odds were everything against them. The table was clear now. Clean wood and lamplight and the quiet of a house that had stopped being a failing property and become, in the particular way that places become things through the people who refuse to give up on them, a home. She sat down, pulled the yield estimate toward her, picked up her pen. Then she set it down again and just sat for a moment in the lamplight and let herself have this. The stillness, the warmth, the sound of Elias's boots on the porch steps, the creak in the dark, the north field waiting. All of it real, all of it hers. None of it given, every bit of it earned.